I'll say about the calorie trackers is, so if I'm used to, usually burn about 1,000 calories, according to this, it's not accurate. But if I go in tomorrow and I do 1,300, it may not be accurate. I don't know what the exact number is, but I can be relatively confident that it's more than the previous session, right? And so in terms of comparison, it might be okay, like, kind of within subject. And then the other thing I was kind of circling around on was, if you're worried about NEAT, tracking your steps can be helpful because people's step counts can spontaneously decrease when they're on a fat loss diet. They don't even realize it. So, and that, again, not a complete measure of NEAT, but what we've had some clients do with our team BioLane coaches is they'll say, okay, you're at 8,000 steps right now. We're not going to add any purposeful cardio, but whatever you need to do to maintain that 8,000 steps, do that. And sometimes they have to add, 15, 20, 30 minutes of cardio because their spontaneous activity that they're not even aware of goes down.
That's a really excellent point. I've heard, the 10,000 steps per day number was, we all heard that. And then I learned that 10,000 was just kind of thrown out as an arbitrary number. So we're like the 8-hour intermittent fasting thing. There's a story behind that. Because I actually spoke to Sachin, and it turns out that the graduate student in his lab that did that initial study, which was on mice, by the way, was limited to being in lab for about 8 hours by their significant other. So the 8-hour feeding window is actually the consequence of this person's relationship.
That is a really great point that people don't realize when a lot of people will try to copy like scientific studies. And I'll tell people, like, listen, scientific studies are so confined. You need to be very careful with how broadly you apply what's in there, right? Like they're a very big hammer is kind of the way I look at it. Okay. They're not a scalpel. They're a big hammer. And I think a lot of times in terms of coaching, scientific studies will tell you what not to do rather than what to do, right? But getting back to your question about like exercise, appetite. So first off, I'm not really aware if there's evidence showing like differential effects of different forms of exercise on appetite. It's possible. But again, it also could be like a placebo effect, right? Because we, like for example, you and I grew up in an era where the muscle magazines, it was like, well, as soon as you finish your workout, you gotta have your biggest meal of the day, right? And when I say placebo effect, I think people have the wrong idea of what the placebo effect is. They think that's just a feeling. Placebo effect can actually change your physiology. People don't realize this. There's research showing that a placebo, or the power of suggestion, is basically as powerful as some pharmaceuticals. And one of the great examples I like to use is actually there was a study we just covered in our research review on creatine, where they did 4 groups, not supplemented with creatine, told they weren't supplemented with creatine, not supplemented, told they were supplemented, supplemented, told they weren't, supplemented, told they were. Basically, it just matters what they told them.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
This is incredible. I have to get this study so we can link to it. A colleague of mine at Stanford, she's been on the podcast. I'd love to introduce you to, because I think you guys would really riff. First of all, she was a former D1 athlete, and then runs a lab at Stanford in psychology. This is Leah Crum, and grew up in this, very athletic, obviously, and very, very smart. And her laboratory focuses on these belief/placebo effects, where if you tell people all the horrible things that stress do to you in terms of your memory and cognitive functioning, and then you give them a memory test, they perform well below baseline. If you tell them that stress sharpens them in the short term, and that adrenaline is this powerful molecule that can really tune up a number of memory systems, memory improves. And it's remarkable. Yeah. And it's consistent, and they've done this for any number of different things, including food allergies, for instance. Incredible results. In any case, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. I take creatine monohydrate, and I have for years, 5 grams a day.
It's great,
and it's great, and I believe it's great. So, is there a compound effect of believing it's great and it actually being great?
Not in this study, but so I think. The thing to point out, people will misinterpret that as creatine doesn't work. And that's not what that says. What it says is your beliefs about what it does are probably just as powerful as what it does, right? So they actually did a study, and I don't have the citation, but it was, I think, within the last 10 years, where they told people they were putting them on anabolic steroids. And wouldn't you know it, they had better gains even though they weren't actually on anabolic steroids, they had better gains than people that they didn't tell were anabolic steroids. And that's like hard outcomes, strength, lean body mass, those sorts of things. So when people say, well, I wouldn't fall for the placebo effect, it's like, you don't have to fall for it. If you believe it to be true, the power of belief is very, very powerful. And as a scientist, I wish sometimes I was ignorant so that I could subject myself to the placebo effect more often.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of getting back to, that's just a possible explanation of maybe why, and I'm the same way. Like I get done with a workout, like a resistance training session, I'm like, I'm ready to eat, right? Now, if you look at the literature overall on exercise and appetite, it's not always what you'd expect. Consistently, it seems to show that exercise actually has an appetite suppressant effect. So people don't tend to compensate, at least fully, for the amount of movement they do. And there is some evidence that you've probably heard people say, well, exercise is a really poor weight loss tool, right? Like if you figure out how many calories you should be burning from it and you do that, you end up getting less weight loss than you would predict.
I have a family member who is perfectly happy to eat less, but doesn't loathe exercise, but dislikes exercise.
Yeah.
And they're of healthy weight, but I'm always encouraging them to exercise more. And so this is an ongoing battle in our sibling relationship.
Well, one thing I would say is that exercise, independent of anything that happens with your body weight, you will be healthier. So exercise is one of the only things that will actually improve your biomarkers of health without even losing weight. So there's it'll improve your insulin sensitivity, inflammation, all that stuff. So everybody out there looking for a hack to be healthier, exercise is the hack, right?
Crucial point. And our mutual friend, Dr. Peter Attia, I think has gone on record several times now saying that of all the things that one could take, NMN, et cetera, metformin, regardless of whether or not one takes those or doesn't take those, that the positive effects on longevity by way of biomarkers from regular exercise is, far outweighs all of those things combined. Not that those things don't necessarily work. We're not going through them in detail now, but that exercise is by far the best thing we can do for our health span and lifespan.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And when you're talking about weight loss, people miss the point of exercise, I think. There's some work that came out from Herman Poncer as well that basically showed if you do 100 calories from exercise, you have a 28 calorie reduction in your basal metabolic rate in response to that. So it's kind of like this constrained energy expenditure model, right? But what I would say is, okay, well, there's still a net of 72, right? So it's still okay. And the other thing is, I think the effects of exercise on weight loss are actually more due to what it does to appetite. So if you look at people who lose weight and keep it off for a number of years, kind of outliers because most people don't keep it off for years, over 70% of them engage in regular exercise. Of people who do not keep weight loss, maintain weight loss, less than 30% exercise regularly. So now that's just a correlation. That doesn't necessarily prove causation, but there are some pretty compelling studies showing that exercise increases your sensitivity to satiety signals. So basically you can have the same satiety signals, but you're more sensitive to them when you exercise. And there's actually a really classic study from the 1950s in Bengali workers, where they looked at basically 4 different quadrants of activity. So you had sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, heavily active, basically based on their job choice. And they didn't have an intervention. They just wanted to track them and see how many calories did they actually eat. So it was like a J-shaped curve. So the sedentary actually ate more food than the lightly active or moderately active. But from lightly active to heavily active, they almost perfectly compensated how many calories they should be eating. So to me, that suggests when you become active, you can actually regulate your appetite appropriately, or much more appropriately than if you're sedentary.
And do you think this has to do with changes in the brain centers that respond to satiety signals from the periphery, and or do you think it has to do with changes in blood sugar regulation? What I was taught, and I don't know if this is still considered true, is that spikes in blood sugar will trigger a desire to eat more, even though it's kind of exactly the opposite of what you need when you have a spike in blood sugar. And there's this kind of, and we'll get into this when we talk about artificial sweeteners, there's this idea in mind, I think I adopted, perhaps falsely, that, you eat something that's sweet or that tastes really good and you are suddenly on the train of wanting to eat more. Yeah. And I could imagine how exercise, if it is increasing the satiety signals, could be working in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I think I think the effect is probably mostly at the brain level. The effects on blood sugar, the research out there is not very compelling for blood sugar driving appetite. Now, if you become hypoglycemic, yes, you'll get hungry, but it's a different kind of hunger than like your normal, like I feel kind of empty and my stomach's growling. Like they can go together, but usually like the hypoglycemia is like, I am hot, I feel like I'm gonna pass out. Like you wanna eat something not because your stomach's growling, but because you know that you just need some fuel.
It's like you're getting pulled under.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I've been there when I've done longer fasts, something I don't do anymore, and drank a lot of black coffee. There was probably an electrolyte effect there because coffee has you excrete sodium and other electrolytes. Yeah. And then just feeling like I needed something, this whole thing, like I need something, this kind of desperation. I never want to be back here again. Hypoglycemia is very uncomfortable.
It's not fun. So, again, when they look at, actual randomized control trials of implementing some exercise where they're, pretty controlled environment, they typically see people, if anything, they eat less as opposed to eating more. Now, some people, again, that's, studies report averages, right? And there's individual data points. So there are some people who at least anecdotally report that exercise makes them more hungry. That's completely valid. It could be their beliefs around it. It could be a number of different things, but it's important to understand that there is individual variability. And I think one of the things that I've learned to appreciate more is not trying to separate psychology and physiology. We do this a lot. It's like, well, I want to know the physiology. I don't care about the psychology of it. And now I'm kind of appreciating more psychology is physiology. That like with most things now we have kind of the biopsychosocial model. And I'll give you an example of this. A lot of people get really caught up with appetite. And if we could just suppress people's appetite, that's part of it. But people don't just eat because they're hungry. They eat for a lot of different reasons. Social reasons, especially. So can you remember the last social event you ever went to that didn't have food?
No.
Right. If you look at dinner plates from the 1800s, they're about this big. Now how big are dinner plates?
The whole buffet.
Right? Right.
Yeah.
There's situational cues, right? You're sitting down to watch TV. Oh, grab some popcorn, grab some, snack, whatever.
I even see this with it, how one person will pick up their phone and then everyone picks up their phone. I think there's a similar effect with food.
Yeah, and same thing, right? Like, how many times have we either done it ourselves or been experienced people saying, "Oh, you should have some. You should have," or like, alcohol, especially, right? Like people will. I was hanging out with somebody last night, and I had a beer, and they just had, a water, and I'm like, I feel no need to try and convince them to do that with me. You know what I mean? But as humans, we're kind of herd animals. Like we don't want to be doing something out in isolation on our own. Now this is a very tenuous, I guess, belief of mine, but, doing things alone in isolation, during kind of, ancestral times, that's going to set off your alarm system, because if you don't have other people, you can't protect yourself. Right. So typically things were done together in groups. And I think that's a lot of the reason why we tend to be just tribal in nature about a lot of things, right? So the whole point to that is, on the list of reasons why people eat, I've gotten to the point where I think that hunger is actually not even the main reason people eat. Stress, lack of sleep. Boredom.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So unless, we can do something that addresses all those things, there's a line from a review paper. This review paper came out in 2011. It's by a researcher named McLean, and it's the best review paper I've ever read. It was called Biology's Response to Dieting, the Impetus for Weight Regain, and basically went through all the mechanisms of these adaptations that happen during fat loss diets and how biology's response is to try to drive you back to your previous. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but at the end of the study, he said, basically, the body's systems are comprehensive, redundant, and well-focused on restoring depleted energy reserves. And any attempt or any kind of strategy for weight loss that doesn't attempt to address a broad spectrum of these things is going to fail. And so that's why when people say, well, just do low carb, you won't be hungry. I'm like, yeah, but people don't just eat because they're hungry. So I think really like trying to get outside the box and think about these things. And especially when you read some of the literature, I recently read a systematic review of successful weight loss maintainers, which I thought was really interesting. So they took people who had lost a significant amount of body weight and kept it off for I think it was 3 years. And they basically asked them questions and tried to identify commonalities. And there were some things that I expected, like cognitive restraint, self-monitoring, exercise. And then one of the things they said that I found really fascinating was pretty ubiquitous between people. They said, I had to develop a new identity. So are you familiar with Ethan Suplee?
No.
So Ethan is an actor. He's been in like Remember the Titans and American History X.
I certainly saw American History X.
Yeah. So he was very large. Like he was like 550 pounds and now he's like 230 and jacked.
Wait, he was how much?
550 pounds.
Wow.
And he has it whenever he puts up posts on his Instagram of him training, it'll say, I killed my clone today. And I asked him, like, is this what you're talking about? Like creating a new identity? And he said, this is exactly what I'm talking about because I had to kill who I was because there was no way I was going to be able to make long-term changes if I just didn't become a new person. Because and addicts talk about this, right? Like people who are alcoholics, they had to get new friends. They had to hang out at different places because their entire life had been set up around this lifestyle for alcohol. And I would actually argue that eating disorders or disordered eating patterns is much harder to break than other forms of addiction. And you think about food addiction, well, in some ways, bulimia and anorexia are still addictions. You can't stop eating. Like if you're alcoholic, you can abstain from alcohol. If you become addicted to, say, cocaine, you can abstain from that. You can never abstain from food. And so now imagine telling a gambling addict, well, you've got to play this slot, a couple times a day, but no more. Like that's really challenging. So, yeah, I just like all this stuff. It's so important to be comprehensive with how we treat these things.
These are incredibly important points. And to my knowledge, I don't think anyone has really described it in a cohesive way, the way that you're doing here. It's so important for people to understand this because obviously as a neuroscientist, I think, the nervous system is creating our thoughts. Our thoughts and feelings are related to psychology. And therefore, of course, our physiology and our psychology are one and the same. It's bidirectional. Nowadays, there's a lot of interest in brain-body, in particular gut-brain axis, and we can talk about that. But I really appreciate that you're spelling out how there are these different variables. Each one can account for a number of different things. Exercise clearly has a remarkably potent effect, both during the exercise in terms of caloric burn, overall health, and biomarkers. And then this is wonderful to learn that it can increase the sensitivity to satiety signals. I think that makes, at least in my mind, places it very high on the list of things that people should absolutely do. But that there are other factors too. And the identity piece is fascinating. It reminds me also, your story reminds me also of David Goggins, who is, he talks about his former very overweight self, almost as if it was a different person. And he uses language that I'm not going to use here. But met David, know David a bit, and he's every bit as intense and driven and a remarkable human being as he appears to be online. He is that guy. But it does seem like he had to more or less kill off a former version of himself and continues to do that every day. And I think what your point about this other fellow who does it through a similar process. The word today seems to really matter. It's not like you defeat this former version of yourself and then that person is buried and gone. You said, I killed my clone today. And that's the way that David talks about it also. So this is a daily process. And I think this is not just a small detail in tying together all these things. I think that what you are describing is fundamental, because we can pull on each one of these variables and talk about each one of them. But at the end of the day, we're a cohesive whole as an individual. Sorry, you were about to say.
That gets actually into one of my favorite topics, which is, why do we have such a hard time with losing weight, but more so keeping it off? Because of obese people, 6 out of every 7 obese people will lose a significant amount of body weight in their life. So why do we still have an obesity problem? They don't keep it off. Why don't they keep it off? When you look at the research, basically what it suggests is because people think about, I'm going to do a diet and I'm going to lose this weight, and they do not give any thought to what happens afterwards, right? It's like, think about if you have some kind of chronic disease or a diabetic, right? You can't just take insulin once and that's it, right? You got to take it continuously. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. If you do a diet and you lose, 30 pounds, fantastic. But if you then just go back to all your old habits, you're going to go back to where you were, if not more. You can't create a new version of yourself while dragging your old habits and behaviors behind you. So what I'll tell people is, because people say, well, I'm doing a carnivore diet, or I'm doing this diet or that diet. And I'll say, that's fine. Do you see yourself doing that for the rest of your life? And if the answer is yes, if you really believe that that's going to be sustainable for you, and plenty of people, low carb, intermittent fasting, whatever, they say, felt easy. I could do this forever. Great. If you're going to lose weight, you have to invoke some form of restriction, whether it is a nutrient restriction, like low carb, low fat, a time restriction, intermittent fasting, any form of time restricted eating, or calorie restriction, tracking macros, whatever. So you get to pick the form of restriction. So pick the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive to you as an individual, and also do not assume that it will feel the same for everybody else, because I made this mistake. Whereas like I track things. And so I allow myself to eat a variety of foods. I allow myself to eat some fun foods, but I track everything, and I'm able to modify my body composition and be in good health doing that. Now, it doesn't feel hard for me. Part of it's I've just been doing it for so long. But to other people, that's very stressful. They don't want to. They say, well, I'd rather just not eat for 16 hours. If that feels easy for them, do that. Because the one thing that there was a couple of meta-analysis on popular diets. And basically what they showed was they were all equally terrible for long-term weight loss. But when they stratified them by adherence, and none of them were better for adherence overall, but when they stratified people just according from lowest adherence to best adherence, it was a linear effect on weight loss. So really what it says is, what is the diet that's going to be easiest for you to adhere to in the long term? And you should probably do that. And people, again, this is where I step back and take the 10,000 foot view. Somebody will say, well, I'm going to do ketogenic because I want to increase my fat oxidation and I want to do this. And they're talking about all these mechanisms and everything. And that's great. Can you do it for the rest of your life, right? Is this going to be something sustainable for you? And if the answer is no, you probably need to rethink what your approach is going to be.
It's incredibly important message. Basically that, if I could highlight, if there was a version of highlighter, boldface, and underline in the podcast space, I would highlight, boldface, and underline what you just said. And for those of you that heard it, listen to it twice and then go forward, because it's absolutely key. I think it also explains a lot of the so-called controversy that exists out there. I think it also crosses over with the placebo effect. I almost want to say, pick the nutrition plan that you think you can stick to for a long period of time, ideally forever, and pick your placebo too, because there is a lot of placebo woven into each and every one of these things: intermittent fasting, keto, probably even vegan versus omnivore versus carnivore.
Well, they even talk about the diet honeymoon period, right? Where like you go into a diet and you're all fired up about it and like you're very adherent. And then what happens with every single diet, without exception in research studies, is once you get past a few months, adherence just starts waning and going off.
Here we are really talking about a form of relationship. I'm not saying that to be tongue in cheek. Actually, we had a guest early on in the podcast, Dr. Carl Deisroth. He's a psychiatrist and bioengineer at Stanford, tremendously successful Lasker Award winner, et cetera. And he talked about love as a sort of an interesting aspect of our psychology, where it's a story that you co-create with somebody, but that you live into the future of that story. When you pair up with somebody, that we was referring to romantic love, that there's this sort of mutual agreement to create this idea that you're going to live into. So it's not just about how you feel in the moment, it's also that you project into the future quite a lot. I'm seeing a lot of parallels with a highly functional and effective diet. And I love it. I'm not setting this parallel up artificially. I'm setting up because I think that ultimately it boils down to what you said earlier, which is that the brain and our decisions about what we are going to stick to are tremendously powerful.
And I think one thing I will say is, like, keep in mind, when you look at the research data, the meta-analyses on, say, time-restricted eating versus non, when calories are equated, doesn't seem to be a difference in weight loss, fat loss, and most biomarkers of health. Same thing for low carb versus low fat. If you equate calories and protein, there was a meta-analysis done by Kevin Hall back in 2017 where they looked at actual loss of body fat. And another important point was I think there was 22 studies in this, but all of them provided food to the participants, right? That's important because that ensures that adherence is going to be much higher in those studies, whereas like various free living studies, sometimes you can see funky results.
People are sneaking food or they're just not really
it's very
eating
difficult.
The way that the study would ideally have them
unless the person is getting like continuous support. Like studies where they have a dietitian talk to people like every week tend to actually have pretty good adherence. But I mean, that's expensive to have done a study. And again, like what limits studies? Money, and money, right? But the low carb versus low fat, when protein and calories are equated, basically no difference in fat loss. Now, some people get upset about this, but it's like, to me, that's like, this is great because you get to pick the tool you want. The one tool, it doesn't seem to be that much better than another. So pick the one that works for you, right? Whatever lever you've got to pull, you've got a bunch of different options.
You mentioned picking something you can stick to for a period of time. Is there ever a case for someone saying, look, I like to eat low carb or even keto for 6 months and then switch to a more standard omnivore caloric maintenance type diet and then switch back? Is there any downside to doing that for sake of health or weight loss over time or weight maintenance over time? Because I realize not everyone is trying to lose weight. And I definitely want to talk about at some point how to eat to maintain weight, because I think there are a significant fraction of people out there who are trying to do that. But yeah, is there any downside to being a dabbler, keto for a few months and then omnivore for a few months, et cetera?
I think that's actually a great thing, especially to like maybe find what you feel is easiest for you, right? But in terms of like as a strategy, I mean, I guess, some people, this might get into dopamine, but like, change and get something new and like, you feel a little bit more positive about it.
The new partner model.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it's how I would usually set things up initially for somebody, but if somebody said, hey, I just like to have some variety and change it up, as long as they're still like, their behaviors and they're doing portion control or whatever it is, and they're able to sustain a calorie deficit or, depending on whatever their goal is, I don't think there's really any downside to it. I do think the one thing to keep in mind is when you look at like going between extremes, so like low fat to low carb or vice versa, there can be in that transition period a little bit of weirdness, for lack of a better term. Like, for example, if you've been on a ketogenic diet and all of a sudden you move to like a higher carb diet, you'll be like basically insulin resistant for just a short period of time. Now, is that going to cause any health problems? Probably not in the long term, especially if you're still controlling calories. But just because your body has kind of like upregulated these systems dealing mostly with fat and glucose production rather than glucose metabolism. So now if you start taking glucose or carbohydrate back in, like for example, you give somebody an oral glucose tolerance test after they've been on keto, they'll do pretty terribly at it. But that doesn't last that long.
About how long?
few weeks.
I think that's important for people to know, because I have a feeling during those first few weeks are the period of time when a lot of people will go running back to what they were doing previously, which is not to say that they shouldn't, but I've certainly done that. I've tried very low carbohydrate diet, and I would have assumed, and now I know I'm completely wrong, but I assumed that I was so carbohydrate starved for so long that my insulin sensitivity, which is a good thing, by the way, folks, would have gone through the roof, and I would be able to just sponge up every bit of glucose that I would have ingested through carbohydrate. So I did indeed switch over, and I felt like I had pretty terrible brain fog. I even got some jitters, and I thought, wait, what is this? You know, my blood sugar was low before. Now my blood sugar should be in more moderate territory. But based on what you just said, I had upregulated the enzymes and systems in the body for fat metabolism on the keto diet, and then switching over, there was basically a ramping up of the molecules involved in presumably in glycolysis.
Transition period. I mean, think about like if you haven't weight trained before and you start weight training, you're going to feel pretty terrible, right? Like you're going to be sore and stiff and all that kind of stuff. But I will say you aren't necessarily wrong in what you said about being more insulin sensitive, because it depends on how you measure insulin sensitivity. So if you measure with something like, fasting blood glucose or fasting insulin or even HOMA-IR, those tend to be pretty good on low carb. But then if you do an oral glucose tolerance test, it tends to be pretty bad. And so it depends on your specific measure, right? So I think that, the idea that keto makes you, glucose intolerant or insulin resistant, I think, again, it's just a transition period, and I'm not too worried about it. But it is something important to keep in mind. And one of the reasons, like if somebody was to transition out of keto, typically if like I'm working with them or one of our coaches are working with them, we'll kind of instruct them to do it like slowly and kind of systematically over like a 4 to 8 week period. That way, hopefully, they're not having that period of 2 weeks where they're like, oh man, why do I feel so terrible?
Very important point. I want to go to the other end, literally and figuratively, and talk about gut